Thank you, Pat, for that reading. Genesis. Over these next few weeks, we are talking about the old stories and visiting some of the old stories from our Old Testament that we may or may not be familiar with. Last week we talked about Noah. This week we're talking about Abraham. And there's something interesting when Abraham is introduced to us for the first time. In the earlier chapters of Genesis, God speaks to Abram, whom he later names Abraham, renames Abraham. We ask ourselves perhaps the question, who is Abraham? We first learn about him in Genesis 12. Here's what's interesting about Abraham is that when we first meet Abraham, he's already fully grown, older in age. He is childless. He and his wife have no children, and he is in Haran. Abraham has lived almost half of his life, and nothing about him so far has caught our attention. It's as if he appears out of the blue. Most of the characters that we read about in our Bible are introduced to us as children, as infants, or even as prenatal predicaments. Huge swaths of Genesis tell us of Ishmael and Isaac before they're even born. Jacob and Esau wrestle in their mother's womb. Joseph struggles as a teenager with a many-colored coat. Moses floats down the Nile River in a bulrush basket. The young boy David kills the giant Goliath. Samson is dedicated to the Lord and promised to do great deeds before he is even born. And the baby Jesus is wrapped in a swaddling cloth. And yet Abraham is 75 years old before we're introduced to him. And we catch just a glimpse of his backstory through his lineage. His father is Terah and can be traced back to Noah. But even as we glimpse this brief genealogy of him, we realize that Abraham has no children. It's as if he and his wife cannot have children. And in the Old Testament time, and particularly in this time which Genesis is concerned with, genealogy or lineage, children, and especially sons, are vitally important. And that Abraham has none of this is astounding. And so perhaps as we are reading that introduction to Abraham, we begin to learn about him, we find ourselves not admiring him, but maybe pitying him. Or perhaps not caring at all, feeling indifferent, which is even worse. He's childless and childhoodless. And since everything in the Bible is purposeful, we're left asking ourselves the question, well, what is the purpose with Abraham? What is the purpose behind his being childless? God is looking for someone to bless the entire world. God is searching for someone special. We know God has this divine vision of an ultimate, intimate relationship. And in the beginning of Genesis, God created the world, light and darkness, earth and sea, sun and moon, creatures of every kind. And after every step, God pauses and says, "It is good." And on the sixth day, we see the masterpiece of God's creation, Adam and Eve, and God says, "It is very good." Humankind is central to God's world. People are central to God's divine vision of this ultimate, intimate relationship. And we know that this original vision of God's was corrupted by Adam and Eve's disobedience to God. And at that time, God could have given up on this divine vision, gone back to the perfect relationship found in the Holy Trinity, God the Creator, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. But that's not what God does. As we read Genesis, if we look at the first 2 chapters of Genesis, it's all about God, God's creation, God's vision of a wonderful relationship, God walking and talking with Adam and Eve in the garden, and the rest of our Bible is all about God giving us a second chance. It's all about God calling to us, drawing us nearer to be in relationship with God. Not only with God, but with one another. And today, on this Mother's Day, as we look at Abraham and ask ourselves the question, why Abraham and Sarah don't have any children, we see in chapter 17 that God comes to Abraham, actually in chapter 15, making a covenant, telling Abraham that he will be the father of nations, that kings will come from him. His children will be as many as the stars in the sky, the dust on the ground. When God first approaches Abraham, Abraham is asked to do something. Something that many of us might consider, I would never do that. The Lord said to Abram, leave your land, your family, and your father's household for the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation and will bless you. I will make your name respected, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and those who curse you I will curse, and all the families of earth will be blessed because of you. Here's what's fascinating. Abram left just as the Lord told him. Abram didn't question, he didn't ask, he didn't negotiate, he didn't say, well, I can't do it today, maybe tomorrow. Abram just left. Abram went. What an amazing response from this man, Abram. Can you picture in your own life God speaking to you and saying, I want you to go do something completely different than what you are used to. I want you to leave the place in which you are comfortable, the place you grew up in. I want you to do this. Think of how hard that would be for us to just go. We have business that we have to finish first, or we might say, well, I'm close to retirement, so I'll wait until retirement, or I can't leave, this is the house I grew up in, or I can't do that. That's just way beyond what I could ever possibly do. It would be hard for us. I would bet. But Abram went. Abram went. Well, as God continued to speak to Abram, as God makes this covenant, this promise to Abraham that you will be the father of many. At one point in their conversation, God changes his name from Abram, which means exalted father, to Abraham, which means father of many nations. Abraham and Sarah are 75 and 65 when they first leave. 10 years later, they're still waiting for God to fulfill that covenant, that promise. And Abraham is now 85, Sarah is 75. They still have no children. And there is this deep emotional pain that comes with wanting something so badly, like a child, and believing that that longing will never be fulfilled. So Sarah, in her infinite wisdom, begins to think, well, maybe God needs our help. out, she concocts a plan where she tells Abraham to go be with her servant Hagar, to have a child with her. Abraham, being the obedient father, says, well, if that's what you want, okay. They do. They have a child. Abraham and Hagar have a child together and name him Ishmael. God comes back and says, thank you, but no thank you. That's not my plan for you. 13 more years go by and Sarah still has no children of her own. Now think about this. Abraham is now 99 years old. Sarah is 89 years old. Whew. They're still going to have children? My goodness. But this is where God's covenant comes into play. God comes to them again and gives them news. 1 year from now, you will have a child. And Sarah hears this news. She's like, I'm 89 years old. This is hilarious. And she begins to laugh. She's almost a century old. Wouldn't you laugh too? I mean, you were just laughing. I heard some of you. You were just laughing. Now, whether hers was a laughter of disbelief, hilarity, uneasy laughter, or maybe a cry from the deep loss of an unfulfilled longing, we don't know. The only question is, can God deliver on God's promise? Can they believe that God is going to fulfill the covenant that God has made with them? The answer to that is yes. Yes. In large, this whole story of Abraham is a story of faith. We see from the beginning when God calls Abraham to pick up his family and leave everything that they know. He had lived there for 75 years. He went. He left. He followed God's will. Abraham was patient in waiting for God to fulfill that promise. Sarah was patient to a point. The late Rabbi Channon Brichto was intimately familiar with Christianity, even though he himself was Jewish. And he wrote an address to the Council of Churches in 1970 when he asked the question, how does God speak in this world? He began with these words, to the eye of faith, the presence of God is obvious. To the ear of faith, the message of God is equally clear, equally obvious. To most of us, though, those two statements are not so obvious. We tend to be more like Sarah, asking the question, does God need our help? We don't often see with the eyes of faith or hear with the ears of faith, even when we know that God has made a covenant with us. Instead, we're impatient people. We're not content to reside in faith. I think I shared this with you before. A friend of mine in Kentucky used to say, I want what I want when I want it, and I want it now. But that's the thing about faith. And make no mistake about it, the underlying message in the story of Abraham is in large that of great faith. Faith is going deeper than our own belief. It is relying completely and with great certainty that God will fulfill the covenant, the promise made. And so in our reading today, we see that God has spoken to Abraham and said, take your son up the mountain and make a sacrifice. If you have children, you know how impossible that would be. And yet Abraham does this. He climbs the mountain with his son. Lays him out on this altar that's been prepared. And the son is even wondering, well, what's going on? And asks, well, where's the sheep? Where's the ram? Where's the sacrifice we're going to make? Abraham says, God will provide. takes his son up the mountain, places him on this altar, and then stands over him with a raised knife, ready to plunge it into his heart because God has called him to do that. There is a difference that I want to be very clear about. In our biblical text, God is speaking directly to Abraham, saying, make this sacrifice. I read and I hear in the news and have over the years where somebody destroys or kills their own family, their neighbors, or whatever. And I say, well, God was speaking to me and said I need to do this. No, that's not God. It's two different stories. And that is really exemplified when we read the rest of this story here, because just as Abraham is ready to plunge down the knife, God says, stop! You have proven your faith. And there is a ram whose horns are caught up in the brush, and that is what they make the sacrifice of. This story, as I said earlier, is one of faith. God made a promise to Abraham. And through that promise, we see Abraham and Sarah blessed with a child whom they name Isaac. Isaac in time has a family of his own with two sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob goes on to have 12 sons, one of whom is Joseph. And the family profligates and begins to fulfill the covenant that God made with Abraham, and their numbers are greatly increased. Abraham has become the father of many nations. And Abraham is considered the father not only of Christianity, but of Judaism and Muslim as well. The kings have come from Abraham's line, just like God promised. And to think it all began with those 3 words following God's command to Abram to go from his country, people, and household. We read, so Abram went. So Abram left. And I think perhaps that is what impressed God about Abraham. He didn't simply believe. In taking God at God's word, he embraced faith. And it's astounding and amazing and wondrous the way God works in our lives when we live in faith.